Welcome back to the Habit-Based Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Ewell, and today we're going to be talking about lessons learned from fasting.
You are tuning in to the Habit-Based Lifestyle Podcast with your host, Jesse Ewell. This is the Habit-Based Lifestyle. Let's go.
So in today's episode, I want to brief this. So I decided on Sunday to start a fast. If you guys are listening to this, our church has a conference coming up, which is actually today, but I've been fasting since Sunday. And just some context around this, I haven't really honestly thought about fasting for more of a spiritual purpose in, pretty much forever. But as I listened to our pastor the last few weeks, I really felt like, hey, I want to really do this, because the only other times I fasted before or went extremely low carb in what I was doing was, for bodybuilding shows or more aesthetic purposes. And so I really want to talk about my experience with this from a different perspective where, maybe the physical side of what I've done before now this is a more spiritual experience. And so I want to kind of dive into this topic because I think it's important to understand that fasting of any time is spiritual just as much as it is physical, if not more. But the physical is what we start with, and then it becomes more spiritual. And so I want to kind of walk through a step-by-step process of that. So I think the biggest thing, I want to go through two things. So maybe, you're someone who's listening to this. Maybe you go to church, you've never done a fast. I would highly recommend it. And the reason why I would highly recommend it is because if you ever have trouble hearing God's voice, it's kind of like the old radios. Again, I'm, in my 40s. So if you're in your 40s, you're listening to this, or maybe older, you'll get what I mean, or maybe even in your late 30s. But it's kind of like tuning in a static radio station on your old radio into like a high definition radio. It's like, for a while, for a few months, maybe that station, or for a few years, that station that you tune into to hear God is kind of staticky. And just by simply fasting alone, it becomes that high definition, radio where you hear his voice clearly, loudly, and it speaks to you in a different way. And that's maybe one of the first things after 24 hours of fasting that I immediately noticed was that. And so as I began to do that, I began to get, revelations from that. And I feel like God began to speak to me in a different way that maybe I haven't heard in quite a while, at least at this level of depth, to where I felt like, man, I was really getting a lot of, throughout this whole time, this whole week, I've been getting a lot of great revelations and words. And I want to kind of walk through what those are and share those. So if you've done a fast, maybe for more body cosmetic things, I highly recommend doing a fast for, 48 hours, 72 hours, as a way to really push yourself. If you're someone who maybe goes to church and you're like, man, I've never really done a fast for this, I recommend it. So whether you're on one side or the other, it's really been a game changer. So here's another big lesson, and it was a revelation that I got the other night, was like, fasting makes us sensitive to our senses. And so it sounds like a tongue twister, but what I want you guys to understand is this: we have 5 basic human senses, sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. But I want to go through a couple other ones too, because these are things that I saw come up. So number one is we have the sense of sight. So we begin to see things differently. Okay. Our ability to see things with our eyes. I believe a lot of times, because of the distractions we have in our normal day life, we become numb to the things that we see. and I could say, okay, maybe on social media, maybe on TV, maybe things our kids watch, maybe things that we have in our everyday life, we become numb to them because we're used to seeing that. And so maybe we see things, perceive things in a different way, in a different light, but fasting helps you see things in a different way with almost better vision, better eyesight, or better awareness. And so with this awareness, it begins to help us see the things that we may need to change, that what we're visually seeing in front of us. Okay. Number two is this: hearing. Our ability to hear, sounds through our ears, vibrations, different things like that, but really hearing the voice of God. Like I said, it's like tuning into a radio station that's been staticky. Now all of a sudden I can hear, and I can hear this voice very clearly. And so it's helped me tune in to, that voice of God, and really begin to, even be able to get a message like this and share it with you. But what we hear when we fast is different than what we hear when we don't fast. And so we begin to tune in to, a different sound, a different voice, and that gives us the ability to hear it at a whole different level. We become sensitive to that. Now I want to talk about taste. So think about this. Somebody who normally maybe eats sugar, high amounts of sugar, carbohydrates, maybe even like sweeteners, things like that. There's been a few times where I've had electrolyte sticks, or I've had certain things I put on my tongue, even some L-carnitine, and the taste of it was completely different. It was like, man, I can tell when I fasted away from some of these things, because the sensitivity in my taste has went up tremendously. And so certain things begin to taste much different than they did before. And so our sense of taste changes, our appetite changes when we're fasting. We may no longer crave the things that we normally do. And so many times we crave things that are bad for us. But I really believe that fasting gets us to crave things that are good for us. And so if you think about that in the context of even social media, like what am I craving from social media or picking up my phone? All of a sudden, when we begin to fast, we recognize that, hey, maybe this isn't something that I need to crave as often as I would. And I started to look at, man, my phone use has really gotten out of control, to where a lot of times my average phone use per week is 7 hours. As I began to fast, I started to recognize that maybe I only need to really be on my phone for 3 hours or 4 hours. And I started craving, getting on social media less and less. I started craving less use of my phone and wanting a different appetite for that. And so taste isn't just with food, it's with having an appetite for maybe something that you normally wouldn't. And so, that taste is really what we say appetite. Our appetite changes when we begin to fast, and we no longer crave things, or we're aware of the things we're craving, and then we have the ability to change it. Now, the other thing is smell. One of the things that I recognize is, like, you can really detect scents through our nose. We can really recognize odors differently. But, like, with that being said, one of the things that I found that I liked is I actually liked cooking. I love cooking, but one of the things that I really liked to do fasting was actually cooking for my family, cooking for my kids. And it cut down on my appetite. It cut down on the food I craved, and almost gave me a bigger satisfaction. So it was like I was doing something for someone else. And so if you think about it, it's almost like fasting is not about us anymore. It's about serving. And how, when we cook for someone, we're serving them in a different capacity versus being someone who always consumes. And so when we get into this place of hunger, appetite, smelling drives our senses to want to fulfill that smell, right? And so we all of a sudden become a consumer versus someone who's serving. and our ability to smell gives us the ability to either consume or to serve, and that goes all the way even into our appetite. And so really the smell piece of this was really where I began to serve at a greater level, because smelling the food I was making was like, wow, this smells really good. I wonder if, my kids will like this, or I wonder how it tastes. But it really got me into the place of really being able to serve. The last piece is going to be touch. And so, the physical sensation, you have skin, you have included, pressure, all these things, but like what we touch. But what I got from this was really, God being able to touch me, not in a physical way, but where I felt his presence. And so by feeling his presence, feeling the Holy Spirit's present, it got me to touch and feel things differently. I began to feel that over my body and have an experience with that. But that's really what I felt like with touch. And so I think about all these senses that I'm missing out on because I'm not fasting on a consistent basis. And so these are all things that I begin to tune into a lot more, and have a really powerful experience. And then the last thing is being sensitive. This is outside of these other senses, but being sensitive to our feelings, thoughts, emotions, and even being more sensitive to other people and being empathetic to them, and kind of putting yourself in their shoes. And I really believe that all these things that I walk through are all really characteristics of Jesus and how he kind of represented himself in, the kingdom and things like that. And so, his number one thing was always about serving other people. It was about being empathetic, but also, it was about hearing God's voice, having the Holy Spirit present, all these things. And these are all really senses of Jesus that I think about. And these get us to be able to tune into those and have a greater relationship, a greater connection to him. And that's been probably the most powerful, thing of all. I've also kind of felt much calmer. And so it's really, allowed me to, maybe instead of reacting to something, it's allowed me to kind of like think about something a little bit longer, to where I don't react right away to it. I'm actually kind of taking a step back out of it so that I can get clarity on what it is and then move forward. Now, these are really, to me, these are spiritual senses that I've changed and that I've really noticed. I want to walk through a couple physical things. So one of the things that I love to do, which I've done a ton of episodes on, is I really love to do cold plunge, but I've recognized that doing fasting plus cold plunge has been a complete game changer. So even going into a cold plunge for 5 minutes, both of these things are amazing for our brain, for our performance with our brain. And it's really helped. Sometimes I felt like some really basic things that I was working on, I began to be like, oh my gosh, what was I doing again? But just going through this whole process, getting into a cold plunge, I feel like is the ultimate brain power of fasting is great for your brain. And then also cold plunging is great for your brain. And then also adding in nootropics. And also today, after 4 days in, I've started to add in some MCT oil and other fats because I do have the conference tonight. My goal with that is to really be able to have an experience, but also to not feel like I'm out of it. So that's been a really cool thing. But, if you're someone who wants to try fasting, I highly recommend doing at least one cold plunge a day with it. I've done a couple days where I've done it twice a day. It's been amazing, and it's been a complete game changer. So today I will be doing 96 hours of fasting, and then I might go to 100. We'll see. But yeah, I wanted to kind of go through these lessons that I've learned, because I feel like these are really powerful things that I've missed out on because of like, oh, I don't need to fast. I don't have a food problem. But it's not really about the food. It's about, you have a hearing problem. You have a sensitivity problem. You have a sight problem. You have a taste problem. You have a smell problem, and you have a touch problem. And so, maybe you guys are listening to this and you're like, man, I've only ever did fasting for my body physically to look different. But if you have any of these other problems in your life of some of the basic human senses, we become numb to them. This is the reason. This is a way for you to kind of tune back into it. So, guys, thanks so much for joining the podcast today. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, Jesse at habitbasedlifestyle.com. Send me a DM, send me a message, let me know how I can help you with your fast. All right, guys. Hope you have an amazing day.
You are tuning in to the Habit-Based Lifestyle Podcast with your host, Jesse Ewell. This is the Habit-Based Lifestyle. Let's go.